In this playlist, we're going to be going through this statistics textbook by David Friedman, Robert Pisani, and Roger Purvis. This is a really good statistics book. We're going to go through it in detail. And so by the end of this playlist, you're going to have a mastery of statistics. All right, so part one is these first two chapters is on design of experiments. We're going to learn about two types of experiments, controlled experiments in chapter 1 and observational studies in chapter 2. In this video, we're going to go through all of chapter 1. All right, chapter 1, controlled experiments. So in this opening paragraph, we get introduced to some of the key terms associated with controlled experiments. It says a new drug is introduced. How should an experiment be designed to test its effectiveness? The effectiveness of the new drug. The basic method is comparison, right? You want to compare two or more scenarios that have a key difference between them to get a sense for the effectiveness of the new drug. The drug is given to subjects in a treatment group, but other subjects are used as controls. They aren't treated. So you have the treatment group, the group that you give the drug to, and then the control group you don't give the drug to. The control group is unaffected, right? And we're going to compare the results from these two groups to get a sense for how effective the drug is. Subjects should be assigned to treatment or control at random, right? So assigning a subject to the treatment group or the control group needs to be random. That's important. And the experiment should be run double blind, meaning neither the subjects nor the doctors who measure the responses should know who was in the treatment group and who was in the control group. So you see what double blind means. The subjects are blind and the people analyzing the results of the experiment are blind. In other words, the subject doesn't know if they actually got the drug or not. And the experimentalist who's inspecting for the results of the experiment doesn't know if the person they're inspecting got the drug or not. So having the experiment be double blind and assigning subjects to the treatment or control group at random assures that there's no biases in the experiment. Ideally, you want the comparison between groups to have only one variable, whether the person received the drug or not, and that's it. That's the only variable, ideally, in a perfect controlled experiment. Okay, so with these terms in mind, we're going to take a look at a case study of the Salk polio vaccine field trial. The first polio epidemic hit the United States in 1916, and during the next 40 years, polio claimed many hundreds of thousands of victims, especially children. By the 1950s, several vaccines against this disease had been discovered. The one developed by Jonas Salk seemed the most promising. In laboratory trials, it had proved safe and had caused the production of antibodies against polio. By 1954, the Public Health Service and the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis were ready to try the vaccine in the real world outside the laboratory. Okay, so the polio epidemic started in 1916. Hundreds of thousands died, especially children. The Salk vaccine came out in the early 1950s. Laboratory tests showed that it was really promising, but they needed to test it in the real world outside the lab. So the first thing you can think about is, why didn't they just administer the vaccine to a large number of children and see if it worked, right? But it talks about how if the incidence of polio in 1954, if they would have administered the vaccine in 1954 to see if it worked, dropped sharply from 1953, that would seem to prove the effectiveness of the vaccine, right? However, polio was an epidemic disease whose incidence varied from year to year. In 1952, there were about 60,000 cases, and in 1953, there were only half as many, but there was no vaccine administered in 1953. So you can see that just the nature of the disease, how intense it is just random from year to year. So that's not going to work just to administer it to a bunch of children and see if it works. You can't do that. The only way to find out whether the vaccine worked was to deliberately leave some children unvaccinated and use them as controls. This raises a troublesome question of medical ethics because withholding treatment seems cruel. However, even after extensive laboratory testing, it is often unclear whether the benefits of a new drug outweigh the risks. Only a well-controlled experiment can settle this question. So what you need to do is do a test and deliberately unvaccinate some children, vaccinate other children, and compare the two groups. But, that's a tough thing to do. That seems like it's like an ethical issue, right? You're deliberately not going to vaccinate some children. But that's kind of how it is, right? That's the only way. You need to do the test to see if the vaccine works. So if it works, you can save hundreds of thousands of lives. And so what we're going to see is that there were two experiments done, one by the NFIP, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, that was not a well-done experiment. And then there was another one, the Salk vaccine field trial, that was well done. And we're going to compare those two. So the NFIP ran a controlled experiment to show the vaccine was effective. The subjects were children in the age groups most vulnerable to polio, grades 1, 2, and 3. Okay, that seems good, like a good idea so far. The field trial was carried out in selected school districts throughout the country where the risk of polio was high. Okay, it still sounds like a good experiment. 2 million children were involved and 500,000 were vaccinated. 1 million were deliberately left unvaccinated as controls. 500,000 refused vaccination. So just based on this paragraph, this seems like this could be a good experiment. Students in grades 1, 2, and 3, if you randomly select those students in school districts throughout the country, I'm assuming random school districts where the risk of polio is high, that's fine. As long as the risk of polio in those areas is all the same or close to the same. 2 million children were involved. That's a lot of children. So you want a big enough size of subjects, right, to make sure it's random. 500,000 were vaccinated and 1 million were deliberately left unvaccinated as controls. All right. Again, as long as all of this is random, it's like the 1 million that were vaccinated, that's just random, and the 1 million that were unvaccinated were also kind of selected from the same. Both of these were selected from the same random population of students. Then that seems like a good experiment. 500,000 refused vaccination. So like the idea is the parents refused vaccination for their kids. They didn't want to do the vaccination. So maybe you just don't you don't analyze, you don't bring these into the equation because you don't know why they're refusing vaccination. Maybe the students are I don't know. But we're going to see that when we see more details of this experiment, it's not the most unbiased experiment. We're going to get more details later. And also just to point out that the fact that you have 500,000 were vaccinated and 1 million were deliberately left unvaccinated. So one group has 500,000, the other group has 1 million. But as long as you have a sufficiently large number in both, it's fine because you can just compare like the rate of disease per 100,000 subjects. As long as both are sufficiently large, the size of each relative to the other doesn't matter. All right, so it talks about how children can be vaccinated only with their parents' permission. So one possible design, which also seems to solve the ethical problem, was this. The children whose parents consented would go into the treatment group and get the vaccine. The other children would be in the controls. So that's a good idea, right? You can kind of have your cake and eat it too, because the children you don't give the vaccine to, well, they didn't want it anyway. So you don't have that ethical issue. But it says, however, it was known that higher income parents would more likely consent to treatment than lower income parents. Okay, so is that a problem? It is a problem because this design is biased against the vaccine because children of higher income parents are more vulnerable to polio. So you see the bias here that creates? But that seems counterintuitive, right? How are the children of higher income parents more vulnerable to polio? Isn't it the opposite? The lower income children are more vulnerable to diseases, you would think, right? That's why it says that may seem paradoxical at first because most diseases fall more heavily on the poor. But polio is a disease of hygiene. A child who lives in less hygienic surroundings is more likely to contract a mild case of polio early in childhood while still protected by antibodies from its mother. So it develops an immunity, you could say. After being infected, these children generate their own antibodies, which protect them against more severe infection later. Children who live in more hygienic surroundings, higher income children, do not develop such antibodies. They don't develop that immunity. So they're more susceptible to the severe infection later, right? So that's a potential problem. If you did the experiment that way, where your control group was just people who refused the vaccine, then you introduce another variable or another factor into the experiment or into that comparison between the groups. Remember, ideally, you only want one variable between your control group and your treatment group. The variable of one group received the vaccine and one group didn't. If you have other variables or other factors, those factors, it says here, they confound or get mixed up with the main variable, right? Gets confounded with the effect of treatment. Confounded, mixed up with the main factor that you're considering. Now, I want to point this out that, remember, there's no perfect experiment. There's no such thing as a perfect experiment. You're going to have biases and confounding variables to some degree, no matter what. You can't have a perfectly random experiment. So you have to decide if a biasing factor is acceptable or unacceptable based on how much it affects the final result. And the final result is important. What are the goals for the experiment? How precise of a result do you need? Everything's in comparison to what the goal of the experiment is. For this case, if you can have the control group be children with parents that refuse the vaccine, and you can determine that the bias it's going to introduce won't affect coming up with the conclusion that you need to administer the vaccine, then go ahead and do it. Have your cake and eat it too. Don't make children with parents who want them to have the vaccine have to be at risk. Only do that if you have to, okay? It says for the Salk vaccine field trial, this was the well-designed experiment. Several designs were proposed. The NFIP, the poorly designed experiment, originally wanted to vaccinate all grade 2 children whose parents would consent, leaving the children in grades 1 and 3 as controls. And this design was used in many school districts. Okay, so you see the NFIP, they were going to vaccinate all students in grade 2 that would consent, and then have students in grades 1 and 3 as controls. And it talks about how this created biases, and you can see why, because kids are different in different grades. They might interact with each other differently. It says here it's a contagious disease. It spreads through contact. So, you could have one grade be different than another grade based on how the kids interact with each other. And then furthermore, you're having grades 1 and 3 be controls, and that can be any kind of parent that consents or doesn't consent, but you're just dealing with consenting parents in grade 2. So you still have that variable of kids in low-income families being less susceptible to the disease. That variable is biasing the experiment. Many public health experts saw these flaws in the NFIP design and suggested a different design. The control group had to be chosen from the same population as the treatment group, right? If you do it that way, that's going to be more ideal. Do you see how that works? You have this population, one type of child. You choose from amongst that population for the treatment group. You want to choose from that exact same population for the control group. So it says that it took the treatment group to be children whose parents consented to vaccination. So that's a good idea, right? You're just going to consider children whose parents consented to vaccination. That's it. You're going to take a sample, a large sample from children whose parents consented to vaccination, that population as the treatment group, and then choose another large sample and use from that same population as the control group. I mean, actually, the more I think about it, it doesn't really help you with the ethical issue because you're still giving consenting children, you're having them not have the vaccine. So, but I guess they decided that it had to be done. This is the only way to get an experiment with the level of accuracy that they needed. Otherwise, the effect of family background would be confounded with the effect of the vaccine, right? Otherwise, they didn't want to mix in low income with high income, and you've got this family background and the whole situation confounding the results, or getting confounded with the effect, getting confounded with the main variable, not confounding the results. I want to make sure I get the terms right. The effect of the family background of the low income child being more immune, that variable gets confounded with the main variable, whether or not the child had the vaccine. The next problem was assigning the children to treatment or control. right? Okay, so you're choosing from children of consenting parents. Which ones do you assign to control? Which ones do you assign to treatment? It says human judgment seems necessary to make the control group like the treatment group on the relevant variables. Human judgment. So a person would decide based on family income as well as the children's general health, personality, and social habits. A person would decide which, would assign children to one of the two groups. Experience shows, however, that human judgment often results in substantial bias. It is better to rely on impersonal chance as much as you can. So what they're saying here is that they almost, for every child, you can think about, they just flip the coin and then assign them to one of the groups. And this works well as long as you have a sufficient number of subjects. This works well. It's like if you're flipping a coin and you're going to record heads or tails. Well, if you have a large enough number of flips, it's going to approach 50% heads, 50% tails. It's going to approach that because it's random. But you need a sufficient number of flips because I could flip a coin 5 times and I just so happen to get heads 4 times, tails once. That's not enough flips. I need a large enough number of flips and it will approach 50%. And that's what they did. They randomly assigned children to one group or the other. It's a large enough number of subjects. You can assume that it's random enough. Random enough in terms of you don't have to worry about one group is biased in terms of general health, personality, and social habits. You don't have to worry about that. And if you do it this way, so it says when an impartial chance procedure is used to assign the subjects to treatment or control, the experiment is said to be randomized controlled. Okay, so again, when an impartial chance procedure, like we just talked about, is used to assign subjects to the treatment or control, the experiment is said to be randomized controlled. Okay, now they also considered placebo. You want to consider placebo in experiments. So what they did was to administer the vaccine, some children got a shot that was the vaccine. The control group got a shot of salt water. So the children had no idea if they got the vaccine or not. And this is important because it gives an example here of there was another experiment where subjects were given either a real painkiller or a fake painkiller. And they saw that there were cases where some that got the fake painkiller were saying that their pain was relieved, right? It's the placebo effect. Okay, now they also made sure that the study was double blind. So blind and for the sense of the subjects, and that the subjects didn't know if they actually got the vaccine or not. And also the doctors doing the inspections to see if the child had polio or not also didn't know if that child actually got the vaccine or not. And because in this case, it talks about how it can be hard to decide in some cases whether or not the subject has polio. It's hard to tell. And so you want to make sure that the doctor is completely unbiased when making that final decision. So the subjects are blind and the experimentalists performing the inspections, collecting the data, are blind. That's a double-blind study. Okay, and so here are the results. Here's the well-designed random experiment. This is the rate per 100,000 subjects, the rate of having polio. So you've got the treatment and the control group. These were both from high-income families, right? And they also studied non-consenting. This is kind of, you can look at on the side. But this is the main experiment. So the control group, 71. Again, this is the rate of polio cases per 100,000 subjects. The treatment group, 28. And so based on the design of the experiment, where there's minimal biases, this shows the vaccine is very effective. And it also makes sense that the non-consenting group, well, they didn't have the vaccine, right? They didn't consent. Their rate is 46, which is less than the control group. That makes sense, right? They're more immune. That's what they suspected. All right. Now, if we come to the NFIP study, this was the poorly designed experiment. So grades 1 and 3 were the control group. Grade 2 was the vaccinated, but there was also grade 2 that didn't consent. All right. So the control group, 54, vaccinated group, 25. Now, what does this mean? So this is 54 and this is 71. Well, mixed in with the control group is low income and non-consenting, right? So it makes sense that this would be lower than 71. You've got more high immunity children here. Grade 2 got the vaccine about the same here, but the difference, the effectiveness you can see is skewed. Here, the vaccine seems more effective than here because of that bias. And then grade 2, no consent, about the same here. Now, this brings up a good point in that you could argue that, well, maybe this still shows the effectiveness of the vaccine. Maybe you didn't need to do that experiment that was tough on the ethical side. Maybe this is enough, right? This is still a big drop, right? 30 point drop compared to a 45 point drop. And also you could maybe include a factor to like a correction factor. You could say multiply whatever we get here by 1.5 to correct for that bias that we know about. Okay, so it depends. I'm not a doctor. It just depends on the specifics. A doctor would have to make that decision. But just trying to give you a sense for how you can possibly analyze this. Now, it talks about how it says, let us play the devil's advocate and assume that the Salk vaccine had no effect. All right, so let's assume that we conclude that the Salk vaccine had no effect based on these results, on the well-designed experiment results. Well, in that case, then the difference between the polio rates for the treatment and control groups is just due to chance. How likely is that? Right? So if we said that the vaccine had no effect, we're saying that this difference here is just due to random chance. That's what we're saying. So if we're saying that the vaccine had no effect, then the number of polio cases in the two groups should be about the same. If the experiment was random, well-designed, then it should be the case that the number of polio cases in the two groups would be about the same, right? In the treatment and control groups, right? But there's a difference because of random chance. And that's what it says here. Any difference is due to the chance variability, like in coin tossing. Statisticians understand this kind of variability. They can figure the odds against a difference as large as the observed one. The calculation will be done in chapter 27, and the odds are astronomical, 1 billion to 1 against. So what they're saying is, statisticians have a way of determining, okay, if this difference here was random, what are the odds that you would have this large of a difference in this case? 1 billion to 1. If someone arguing that the vaccine was ineffective is wrong, is what that's saying. There's a 1 billion to 1 chance that they're wrong. And we'll learn about this idea and how you calculate it in chapter 27. Okay, section 2, we look at another case study, the portacaval shunt. In some cases of cirrhosis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, of the liver, the patient may start to hemorrhage and bleed to death. One treatment involves surgery to redirect the flow of blood through a portacaval shunt. The operation to create the shunt is long and hazardous. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? Right? So it's saying if you can get through the surgery, then great, you've had success. But do the benefits of the operation outweigh the risk of the surgery? Over 50 studies have been done to assess the effect of this surgery. Results are summarized in table 2 below. Okay, so we've got 51 total studies here that were analyzed by Minch and Chalmers. And each study is listed based on the degree of enthusiasm, I'm assuming from the doctor or the surgeon, marked enthusiasm, moderate, or none. Enthusiasm talking about, did the benefit of the surgery, the resulting benefit, outweigh the risk of the surgery? These had no controls, right? So we have 51 separate studies here. In each of those studies, there would be multiple surgeries. And they're saying that, so like for these studies, there was no control groups. So this is not the best designed experiment. So with these with no control groups, there was 24. The conclusion from the overall study had a high amount of enthusiasm saying that the benefits outweighed the risks. 7 moderate, 1 none, so negative. There was, in other words, the surgery was pointless. We did this risky surgery, this long risky surgery for what? For no reason. Okay, some experiments had controls, but it was not randomized. Okay, 10, 3, 2. And then here was well-designed, randomized, controlled. And so what it's saying here is, look, the randomized controlled were more saying that the benefits didn't outweigh the risks, whereas the poorly designed experiments were saying that it was good. It was the benefits outweighed the risks. But one thing I noticed is that, well, you only have 4 here. You have a big sample sizes here, bigger, and only 4 here. So maybe this is just coincidence. Okay, but the book is concluding that these poorly designed experiments had exaggerated degrees of enthusiasm. So it says here, okay, a randomized controlled experiment begins with a well-defined patient population, right? So the patient population that you're choosing from needs to be well-defined, right? We talked about when it came to the polio vaccine, you were choosing from, students, I think it was students in grades 1, 2, and 3, randomly from districts that are highly prone to the disease, right? That was your population. So here, some patients are eligible for the trial, others are ineligible. Ineligible because they may be too sick to undergo treatment, or they may have the wrong kind of disease, or they may not consent to participate, right? So if we come back here, so experiments, a randomized controlled, a well-designed experiment. The patient population, eligible patients, you assign to surgery or to the control group, right? Surgery or no surgery, and then compare, the benefits afterwards, right? Do they have, does the surgery group have these great benefits that the control group that didn't have surgery doesn't have? Or ineligible, too sick, wrong disease, or no consent, right? You want to be sure that you're not including in the patient population people that are already too sick or have the wrong disease or don't consent, right? Because that's going to bias it. Because, like, for example, the book says how if a patient is too sick, they might decide not to have the surgery because it's a long, rigorous surgery. But then you don't want to include the vitality of this patient as a result of not having the surgery in the experiment, because the negativity of their health may have been there whether they had the surgery or not, right? So like if you look here, so for the poorly designed experiment, it's controlled but not randomized. The patient population, healthier, they're chosen for surgery. Sicker, that's the control group. That's biased, right? You want to make sure that only like healthy, you take all healthy and then choose some for surgery and some for control group and compare it that way. So it says this sort of bias seems to have been at work in the poorly controlled studies. It says in both the well-controlled and poorly controlled studies, about 60% of the surgery patients were still alive 3 years after the operation. In the randomized controlled experiments, the percentage of controls who survived the experiments by 3 years was also about 60%, but only 45% of the controls in the non-randomized experiments survived for 3 years. Right, so if you look here, this is the percentage that survived for 3 years after the experiment was done, after they were chosen or not chosen for surgery. In the randomized experiment, 60%, it was 60% to 60% surgery and control group. Non-randomized, it was 60 to 45. But again, this is because the people that weren't having the surgery were already sicker. That, or there were other biasing factors not associated with strictly the surgery that caused this rate to be lower. It had nothing to do with this had nothing to do with the surgery. That's what they're saying here. Okay, historical controls, section 3. Randomized controlled experiments are hard to do. As a result, doctors often use other designs which are not as good. For example, a new treatment can be tried out on one group of patients who are compared to historical controls, patients treated the old way in the past, right? You see how that works? It's kind of like the polio vaccine. You're saying, let's give the vaccine to a bunch of people right away, and we'll compare that to last year when there was no vaccine. Or in this case, they were treated the old way, just compared to the historical data. That's a historical control because they didn't have that treatment historically. That's why the treatment's new. But you see, just talking about the polio situation, how that can be an issue. The problem is that the treatment group and the historical group may differ in important ways besides the treatment. But maybe they don't. Maybe you can use a historical control. Depends on the accuracy you need. It just depends, right? You have to be smart and analyze the situation, each situation. In a controlled experiment, there is a group of patients eligible for treatment at the beginning of the study. Okay, so in a controlled experiment, so a proper controlled experiment, the title of this chapter is Controlled Experiments. You have a group of patients eligible for the treatment at the beginning of the study. Some of these are assigned to the treatment group. The others are used as controls. That's kind of the most ideal way to do it. But again, that's ideal. You can be smart, and depending on the situation, depending on your desired results, maybe you don't need to do the perfect experiment. In a proper controlled experiment, or like here, you can think about this as being the official definition of a controlled experiment. Assignment to treatment or control is done contemporaneously. That is the same time period. Assignment to treatment or control is done contemporaneously. That is in the same time period. Good studies use contemporaneous controls, right? Like the most ideal studies do. I mean, you can think about it this way, just an extreme example. If you administer the polio vaccine right away in 1954, and all of a sudden the rate drops to like 1%, just like unbelievable drop compared to the previous year. Well, okay, then you conclude that the vaccine works. You don't need to do an official, by definition, controlled experiment. The poorly controlled trials on the portacaval shunt included some with historical controls, so that's why those weren't the best studies. They deviated from an official controlled experiment and used improper historical controls that produced erroneous conclusions. Others had contemporaneous controls, but assignment to the control group was not randomized. Remember, what does that mean to be not randomized? They weren't selecting patients for the treatment group, so for surgery, and the control group, so not surgery, from like a random group of healthy people. The control group wasn't random. They were taking people who were not getting surgery for biased reasons as the control group. Section 2 showed that the design of a study matters. This section continues the story. Coronary bypass surgery is a widely used and very expensive operation for coronary artery disease. Chalmers and Associates identified 29 trials of this surgery. There were 8 randomized controlled trials, and 7 were quite negative about the value of the operation. But by comparison, there were 21 trials with historical controls and 16 were positive. The badly designed studies were more enthusiastic about the value of the surgery. So this is a similar idea to the portacaval shunt. You've got these 29 different studies on the effectiveness of this coronary bypass surgery. So here's these 29 studies. The overall conclusion for the ones that were deemed as done correctly, randomized, controlled, the majority were negative. Had said that the surgery was in effect unnecessary. The ones that were historically controlled, most had a positive outlook. Now, the conclusion is that the badly designed studies were more enthusiastic about the value of the surgery, these historically controlled studies. Now, remember, historically controlled meaning that the doctors are kind of using a shortcut to perform an experiment by comparing results of the surgery to cases in the past where the patients either didn't have the surgery because the surgery is a new surgery, or comparing to cases where patients are treated the old way for coronary artery disease. Why are the well-designed studies less enthusiastic than the poorly designed studies? In 6 of the randomized controlled experiments on the coronary bypass surgery and 9 of the studies with historical controls, 3-year survival rates for the surgery group and the control group were reported. In the randomized controlled experiment, survival was quite similar in the surgery group and in the control group. That is why the investigators were not enthusiastic about the operation. It did not save lives. 3-year survival rate for the randomized, the well-done experiment, the surgery in the control group, it was the same. So what's the point of the surgery, right? But for the historically controlled, the patients that had the surgery did better, had a better survival rate. So that's why it was prone to have a better, more positive review of the surgery. But it says that for the historically controlled studies, the control group were not as healthy to start with as the patients chosen for surgery. Trials with historical controls are biased in favor of surgery. Yeah, so the authors don't go into full specific detail on this, but like maybe the old method of medically dealing with this disease was based on treating patients at a later stage when they weren't as healthy, something like that. Randomized trials avoid that kind of bias. This explains why the design of the study matters. Okay, it gives another example here. The last line in Table 4 is worth more discussion. So they're talking this here. DES, diethyl some chemical, is an artificial hormone used to prevent spontaneous abortion. Chalmers and Associates found 8 trials evaluating DES. 3 were randomized controlled and all were negative. The drug did not help, okay? There were 5 studies with historical controls and all were positive. These poorly designed studies were biased in favor of the therapy. So how could historical controls be applied here? Again, historical controls means you're creating your control group with historical data. So how was spontaneous abortion prevented before DES was available? Use testimonials, case studies based on the old method of treatment as the control group and compare the results of the treatment group to that. The author is saying that experiments designed this way are very susceptible to bias, which is what happened here. The comparisons of the treatment group with the historical group showed that DES had positive results, but the randomized controlled experiments showed the opposite. Doctors paid little attention to the randomized controlled experiments. Even in the late 1960s, they were giving the drug to 50,000 women each year. This was a medical tragedy, as later studies showed. If administered to the mother during pregnancy, DES can have a disastrous side effect 20 years later, causing her daughter to develop an otherwise extremely rare form of cancer. DES was banned for use on pregnant women in 1971. So again, the well-done experiments, the quality experiments were giving a negative review of this DES. All right, let's go through the summary here. Statisticians use the method of comparison. They want to know the effect of a treatment like the Salk vaccine on a response like getting polio, right? The method of comparison, you compare the effect of a treatment on the response. To find out, they compare the responses of a treatment group with a control group. The treatment group and the control group. Usually it is hard to judge the effect of a treatment without comparing it to something else. If the control group is comparable to the treatment group apart from the treatment, then a difference in the responses of the two groups is likely to be due to the effect of the treatment, right? However, if the treatment group is different from the control group with respect to other factors, the effects of these other factors are likely to be confounded with the effect of the treatment. To make sure that the treatment group is like the control group, investigators put subjects into treatment or control at random, right? This is done in randomized controlled experiments. Whenever possible, the control group is given a placebo, which is neutral but resembles the treatment. The response should be to the treatment itself rather than to the idea of treatment. In a double-blind experiment, the subjects do not know whether they are in treatment or in control. Neither do those who evaluate the responses. This guards against bias, either in the responses or in the evaluations.